So welcome to the MeCCSA Radio Studies Network. This is the trial 5x5 Sandbox presentation, which is just a way of sharing research in a way that we thought might be kind of friendly and, you know, non-intimidating and very interesting. And by the kind of interest we've had from people joining, hopefully that's been the case. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to refer to the document that I have in front of me, which is entirely or almost entirely random, and pick on a presenter who just happens to be top of the list. So if you have a something you've got to get off to, let me know now, because I will then prioritize you at the front. But the first person that I've got on my list is actually Gurvinder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my stopwatch on my phone. When it gets to 4 minutes, I'll tell you it's 4 minutes, and then you'll have a minute. I'll be lenient to sort of 30 seconds over, but after that, I think I will, you know, tell you that's it, because this is basically a very quick and, you know, friendly process. So let's try and stick to 5 minutes if we can. So I will say,
share my screen as well, Jerry.
Yeah, you should be able to share your screen, and it should all work. It's all worked in the past, so fingers crossed. And I will now say over to Gurvinder to present her research.
Oh, okay. Hello, everybody, and lovely to see some of you that I haven't seen for ages. I thought this was a great idea, and the reason I was interested in this is because I've kind of got an idea that I want to kind of develop further, but I feel like I need a little bit more help in figuring out how to do the idea, or kind of just some pointers from people. And the reason it emerged, so it's a different workshop that I was trying to do. The reason it emerged was I've been doing a lot of reading just around the future of sort of radio stations. And in one of the books that I was reading, an American produced book, they were quoting different radio station managers about podcasting and how that's overtaking radio and how the American radio station needs to respond and move forward. What was interesting was that one of the quotes they used, which is I think from an English journalist, indicates that in 2016, the audience in America who was listening to podcasts is actually quite diverse. So then I tried to figure out, is that the case here in the UK? And then I kind of looked into some sort of potential research questions, which this is kind of what I'm considering. Like, as a medium, is it sort of democratizing because you can get the alternative message? And when I say alternative, it could be about race, it could be about gender, sexuality seems to be an issue. So I kind of want to explore that idea. And often podcasting as sort of an idea is seen to be quite amateurish, yet Spotify and all the other big names are making quite a lot of effort to monetize, I'd say, or, you know, commodify this particular platform. You know, the BBC's made sounds to capitalize and kind of cape their audio and to give it algorithms and find out what their audience are doing. I think Bauer have hired someone as their head of their podcast, but their podcasts don't seem to be exciting on the face of it when I had a quick look at what they offer. And I guess within that comes that question of, is podcasting a challenge or a threat to radio, which, you know, radios often seem to be very kind of a middle class activity, whereas perhaps podcasting is disrupting it in the sense that maybe younger people or people from other communities who don't feel served by radio are going there. So this is kind of some places that I'm sort of exploring in my head of what I want to do. And when I've looked generally at podcasting research, I haven't done a lot of research into this, just read a couple of papers. It seems that a lot of podcasters are interviewed about the process, about what they're making, how they're trying to reach out. So I think I want to look at the audience. I want to look at the other side, like why does someone choose to listen to a particular podcast? Is it because it's a female-led presenter or not, or the topic? And that's kind of where I feel like I'm going. This was just the book where I found the quote was the Hendricks and Mims book, the 2018 book. But the picture is quite mixed because I was trying to find out what's going on here in the UK. And although Ofcom give us figures on how many people download podcasts, they don't break that down into any sort of group. And I think the most popular podcast is still comedy. So that's interesting in itself. But what a lot of UK reports have said, and this is what some of the schemes, I think Spotify have got a particular scheme, they believe that there's a shortage of female presenter-led podcasts and BAME-led podcasts as well. And they're also still saying there's kind of a lot of literature that suggests that actually podcasting is still quite male domain. So I kind of wanted to see if that was different or if it's changing as a trend as well. So what I kind of think I want to ask from people who are listening to podcasts is does the presenters almost sway them? So does the presenter being from a particular background mean that they're more likely to go there? Or is
That's
it
4 minutes, Gurvinder, just to let you know.
Thank you. Or is it the message that people are kind of portraying out there? Is it the alternative that you're interested in the environment and you want that kind of message? So I need some help. I need to identify a range of podcasts that are kind of diverse and aimed at diverse audiences. And I guess I also wanted to ask for some help from everybody, like, how do I identify those podcasts and how can I find their listeners and how can I reach out to those listeners? And the bigger question, are interviews the best method? I don't know. And that's it from me. Did say I'd be quick.
That was actually under 5 minutes, so congratulations on that. And thanks very much, Gurvinder, for giving the first presentation. I think what we should do is if people have, obviously these are going to spark particular questions and interest from everybody. If you do have anything that you'd like to say, can you write it down or make a note? And at the end, once all the presentations have happened, we'll try and do a sort of plenary thing where people can talk to the presenters and ask questions. Otherwise, I think the time might slip away from us and we might end up overrunning. So what I'm going to do now is call on the next person on my list. So now I'll introduce Laurie Beckstead to give her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, nice to see you. I'm Laurie. Thanks for having me. I haven't joined in on any of the reading groups, but I'd really be interested in it. So thanks for having me here today, and just figure out how to share what I need to share with you. Great, okay. Okay, so I've just been busy over the summer, not really completing, I guess, getting into shape this research project. The question was, how can podcasts be used as peer-reviewed or peer-reviewable research output? And this is kind of an exciting area. A lot of academics are working in this area. And so to situate my approach to the research, here are sort of 3 categories that I think are the ways in which podcasting is currently being used for a research output or that sort of thing. So the first way, and this has been going on for quite a while, ever since, portable recording has been an option, is the idea of data collection. So recording audio, of course, is a great method for ethnographic research. And this actually kind of poses the question in my mind, is there a difference between simply recording data for ethnographic research and using podcasting per se as a data collection tool? And I don't know what the answer is to that yet, but that's a sort of interesting concept. The second category is using podcasts as the actual research output. So I'll just quickly mention a couple of other researchers that I know are working in this area. Siobhan McHugh from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada. She's the host of a podcast called Secret Feminist Agenda. And when she was done season 1, she decided to kind of turn the lens on it to say, well, could this be considered a peer reviewable piece of output? Like, this was a lot of work for me to do, and there's lots of great knowledge creation here. And she invited peer reviewers to kind of judge it on that. And then Ted Rieken, also from British Columbia, Canada, in 2014 put out a podcast ruminating on the idea of, can we just use podcasting as a sort of research output, a legitimate one, quote unquote legitimate. Here's where I situate my work, is podcast as part of the pre-production process. So I decided to try to find the niche in here, as any good podcaster would do, I guess. And so the idea is I wanted to develop a kind of demonstration of how you could use a podcast as a stepping stone on the road to a more traditional research output, i.e. a publication. So what does that look like? I recorded a demonstration episode, and this is a screenshot website I put together. So it's called Open Peer Review Podcast, a demonstration of using podcasting to conduct open peer review of academic scholarship. So far there are 2 episodes. So episode 0 is the explanation of why we're doing this. You know, what can podcasting bring to this process of refining research in progress to help, you know, refine it and polish it and turn it into something that could, you know, could be published. The idea being that, of course, the conversational nature of podcasting and the authentic nature of the conversations that happen in podcasting can help a researcher, you know, dig into their research in ways that writing about it does not. I found the process of talking about my research through this to be completely different. It just used a different part of my brain than writing about it. And so the demonstration episode I recorded the topic was the genetic code of podcasting, a new way of thinking about discoverability. This is also my research. Jerry, have I got the 1 minute thing?
4 minutes, yep, thank you.
Okay, so I have conducted this study of looking at some, like basically the genetic code of podcasting. I invited a peer reviewer. His name is Dario Linares. Some of you might be familiar with his work in podcasting. So he and I had a conversation, and I also invited someone from our Center for Communicating Knowledge at Ryerson University to be the host. So there was a 3-way conversation that lasted about an hour, and I found it really useful as the researcher, sort of, you know, in the hot seat, to really think about my research. Dario brought a lot of new thinking and allowed me some new directions to consider as I refine this for publication. So if you're interested in more information, oprpodcast.ca, and please feel free to reach out to me if what I'd be looking for next is other researchers who would like to kind of test out the sort of playbook that I have developed for, you know, what's a good way of doing this and why. So.
Thank you, Laurie. And feel free, you can, there's a little reaction button. You can share your thoughts if you'd like to at the end. Anyone who's just joined us, it is fine to be here and not present, I just say, but you are, by being here, you are allowing yourself to be recorded, because this will go on YouTube, and then that potentially will allow for other people to get in touch. So thank you very much for the 2 presenters so far. And the next person I have on the list is Leon Clowes, or Clowes. I apologize if I got that wrong.
It's either is fine.
Either. Okay, good. Well, there you go.
And other variations. So we prompted actually because I saw there was an open call for the Radio at the Edges book coming out, and a radio station, Real Rebels Radio, which is based in Hackney, London. And I'm quite closely involved with one of the co-founders who runs the station now, Alicia. And the approach that we take at the radio station is that it's intersectional, intergenerational, and cross-form approach to community radio. And I wanted to excavate some of the findings of that over the last 10 years. So the radio station was set up by Alicia and Charlotte Delaney. It's an interesting kind of cultural mix anyway in Hackney because of all the different communities that live there. I think there's something like 63 languages spoken. And then you've got Stoke Newington. So there's a very kind of middle class element and kind of graphic designers and the whole music scenes and all these different communities who sit alongside one another, and Real Rebels reflects that in some ways. So it is a community radio broadcaster on the internet. It's also a gallery and event space. We did a project last year, by accident I have the t-shirt on, it was a Windrush based project that was Black British artists presenting work about the Windrush scandal here. And Alicia now runs it, and she's supported by her friends really, so it's a Black women-led organisation. So we work in London, in Hackney, there's so many different, I thought it would be good to examine where we sit within the wider sphere of all the different community radios that go on in London and across the UK. I just started looking at what I wanted to do was to have a conversation with Alicia and her to co-write a prospective chapter around that, really, because she is the founder, and I feel it's very important to have her voice central to that. And so I was just looking, I really love some feedback, not popular music research, so I've really only just contextualised the conversation. And I think that to do an analysis of what Real Rebels does, I think it's about looking at the intersectionality. So we have disabled DJs, learning disabled DJs who play quite mainstream music in the daytime. There's also writers and artists who discuss their mental health. So there's a lot of discussion programs that go on. And then there's a lot of queer DJs. I'm one of them, and we play kind of experimental music. So there's a creative disconnectedness and a messiness that ensues. In terms of intergenerationality, I was really interested in what Gurvinder was saying there, really, because old dominates. It is older white men, I'm in that age group, who tend to be the ones that will proactively come, even though it's a Black woman-led organisation. But we are encouraging more younger people to come in and do podcasting. But there's two different worlds, not just about the generations there. And then because there's lots of activist stuff on our Instagram feed, and like I just mentioned, a lot of older white men approach to do radio shows, but we're looking at ways to kind of improve that. But there's all kinds of things that we're doing. So is it possible to have a nucleus like this that where are all these communities sitting, collaborating with one another, or are they just sitting alongside and use the building for whatever purpose? So I think the things that we get out of the conversation and the write-up, and Alicia and I collaborating on this potential chapter, would be about the radio station presenting a model of cross-community working in a level playing field. There's lots of different ways to be involved in the radio station. Okay. I'm on target then. So there's lots of, by having lots of different things, gallery space, radio station, meeting place, there's lots of different ways that people can involve. Precarity leads to transience. We always struggle with funding, of course. Music hires is been difficult during the lockdown time, so there's grant aid and things like that, but it's a month-by-month basis, which makes innovation a virtue of necessity. And I think Alicia would probably agree with me that nobody'd start a community radio station for anything but love. But its diversity is a strength, but we're doing lots of, on Mixcloud you wouldn't know that there's we all fit under the Real Rebels brand, really. And but is this the lesson then, that we can all share the same space and have our disparate identities within that? And there's an anarchic thing, it's a free-for-all, do anything you want, but at the same time community minded. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of this.
Thank you very much, Leon. Very interesting. I'll just take this moment to plug the MeCCSA Radio Studies Network. I noticed one of your references was Hoot Correa, and she's actually on YouTube on the MeCCSA Radio Studies Network Reading Group YouTube channel in an hour-long conversation that we had as part of this reading group. So please take advantage of that if you haven't already. And this video today will also be uploaded to that channel, so you can watch this again. And
I will do it. Really. Thank you. I'd really welcome any other literature suggestions.
Okay, thank you, Leon. And so that brings us to the next person on my list, which is actually Jo. So I will introduce Josephine Coleman, who is presenting on her recent research into the coronavirus epidemic and how community radio in UK has responded.
Yes, indeed. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. So during lockdown, I decided it was a good opportunity to do some online research. I did a questionnaire which I targeted at all 296 community radio station managers or directors in the UK. I had 44 responses, which is quite good statistically, so I'm told. What I would like to do is use that research as a springboard to look at funding issues which inevitably have come up as a result of the investment that's required to keep community radio going. So I will very quickly run you through some of the results that I had. This radio station was down in Purbeck, it's Swanage, and they posted a lot of photographs, as did all the community radio stations, of many of their presenters working from home. And some of the output there you can see under the news section there, or the results, should I say. I found out that 36.4 of the stations that responded really pride themselves on being live broadcasters. And inevitably under lockdown, under the social distancing that occurred, which meant that most of the stations literally had to close down the studios, most of the stations reduced the live broadcasting, so it was all being pre-recorded. However, as you can see, 2/3 more or less said that they were able to retain the same number of shows and more or less the same schedules, and felt also that their stations were sounding more or less the same as before lockdown. I did ask how many volunteers normally were involved actively on the stations, and as you can see, more or less the most popular range was between 21 and 40 volunteers, and the next range 41 to 60. So, you know, it's kind of between, say, around, 30 to 50. During lockdown, that would have changed. But basically, and I think we all know this, anyone that's volunteered in community radio would know that most people are volunteering, in fact, and my data did show that nearly 80% were under 2 paid members of staff. So under lockdown, the numbers did reduce quite a lot. 38.6 remarked that it was a big reduction, 31.8 a little reduction. And as you'll see later, this was partly through access and technology reasons, but also stations were losing income. And it was partly because of the advertisers who'd stopped advertising because they weren't operating anymore, and partly because some of the stations are based in local hubs like coffee shops, and they had to close. So one of the questions I had asked of these managers in the community radio stations was, what was your priority under lockdown? What was the most important thing to you? Was it to sound great on air still, or was it actually just to get something out on air? And for over half of the respondents, they said actually they wanted the balance. They wanted to balance the number of voices they were able to get out on air with the quality of that output. And so I then asked them all to indicate what considerations they took into account when they were working out. Thank you. And as you can see, obviously it was access to the internet and having that digital software, but being able to use it as well. And I think this is where one of the areas of concern arise, of course, is this digital divide that we have, that we talk about. And obviously I found that, yes, community radio was really well placed, but, there are issues, and they are going to have even more funding issues than they have had in the future. So one of my ideas to try and get some research going off this is, how can we get this new corporate social responsibility thing that everyone's talking about for big corporations to do, how can we get some of that into the community radio sector? And it is needed to try and get over some of these inequalities. The stations aren't that well equipped. Some of the volunteers aren't very well trained. And so I'm hoping that maybe I'll find someone that I can liaise with or discuss research ideas with, someone that's already done research into how the community radio sector is expected to fund itself. So that's my presentation.
Thank you, Jo. We're doing quite well actually for time, and thanks everyone for being so concise. And it's now over to me. I'm the next one down on the list as presenting, so I will attempt to time myself, but if somebody else can just keep an eye on the clock, and if I do go wildly over, then just let me know, please. And so, hello, I'm Jerry Padfield. I'm doing a PhD at Falmouth University, and today I want to talk about the kind of what drives my research, at least in community radio. I also research in podcasting. A brief background about community radio in the UK, because not all community radio cultures are the same. It was established, or at least the legal framework was established in 2004. And since then, there are now about 300 community radio stations in the UK. And one of the tenets that it's built upon is this idea that it must provide social gain. This is a bit of a vague term that needs probably some more definition, but that generally means things like giving people who don't traditionally have access to media a voice, so underrepresented on traditional media. So some of the obstacles to participation in community radio at the moment are things like sexism, gatekeeping, or this is my argument anyway, misogyny, racism, a lack of flexibility, so not allowing for women having childcare issues or for transport in rural areas, or just the kind of over prevailing male culture at these stations. It was interesting to hear Leon speak earlier about how even a station which is in a very multicultural place like London, the majority of people that turn up are white, elder, or middle-aged men. And so through my anecdotal and experience of working in community radio, I've noticed this demographic divide. And so I submitted a Freedom of Information request to Ofcom. And Ofcom is a regulatory body for radio and community radio in the UK. And Freedom of Information request is a legal thing in the UK that you can ask to see any data that is held about any particular legal or government organisation. And this is the request, the response that I got, which is basically they do not hold any information. The reason I submitted this request in the first place was because of a former Ofcom employee, who I won't name, who told me that they hold this data and they have a legal requirement to release it. But somewhere along the line, they have now stopped taking this data. And so in that regard, I've started doing some provisional kind of assessment of what the actual situation about the demographic divide is. So this is just a quick thing that I did about the area that I live in, the extreme southwest of the UK. These are the 2 counties and their community radio stations, and you can see it's not a great picture really. We go from the best or the most represented station is Radio St Austell Bay, if you like, which has 35% women, and the worst has 7% women. And there's in no circumstances can you justify this as representative. And even if you take into consideration the idea of social gain, where you're giving groups which have or are underrepresented on traditional media, I think it's safe to say that men are fairly well represented on traditional media. And so in fact, what you could argue is that there should be a slight bias towards women, if anything. And then if you look at the number of women who are actually managers, that's down as low as 15%. There's only 2 women station managers or directors in the southwest of the UK. I don't know if this is even being talked about, but it's very hard to justify. And so this is what kind of drives a lot of my research, addressing the demographic divide.
Jerry, 1 minute.
Thank you. And so what I'm looking at is new methods of inclusion. That includes technological solutions. So using the new technology like WebRTC, which allows you to send audio via web pages, so people can do shows from home. You need an active outreach policy. So you can't, a lot of station managers will say, well, women are allowed here, or, we don't have any policy about not allowing black people. If they turn up, they can have a show. But the fact is you have to actually go out and ask people to do a show and confront this kind of white male dominated scene. And finally, sort of group programs where people feel they can participate 1 month or 1 week out of the month, but not do every week, just to allow more flexible options for women and other people who are not in ideal circumstances to participate. And so that's a very brief overview of what's driving my research at the moment. Thank you.
Good timing.
And thank you. Yeah. I pride myself on my timing.
Okay, great.
Which brings us to, I believe, who is our last presenter. Thanks very much for holding on. This is Dylan Bird, who's a PhD candidate at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And also thank you for staying up so late to be with us all the way from Australia.
Yes, it's getting on.
And I'll just stop my screen. And I'll say over to you, Dylan. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jerry. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, so thanks for having me. This is my first time in this group, so lovely to be here, and thanks so much for all your presentations so far. They've been really, really interesting. So I'm relatively new to my PhD. I'm 5 months in, so very much just taking baby steps. But broadly speaking, I'm doing a practice-based project that's looking at news podcasts and democracy. And this is in the context of over 6 or 7 years broadcasting on community radio in Melbourne as well. So I'm kind of bringing a practical perspective to my research. And I'm just going to kind of present in broad brushstrokes, I guess, where I started out and where I'm going with my research, and then close with some kind of questions that I'm exploring currently. And so it kind of begins with this premise that news podcasts overall punch well above their weight. And so the report by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which came out towards the end of last year, found that news podcasts comprise just 6% of total existing podcasts, but make up 21% of the most popular podcast episodes in the US. And there's kind of similar figures across the likes of the UK, Australia, and Sweden as well. So they very much sort of punch above their weight in terms of their popularity compared to how many there actually are out there in the world. And that Reuters report also really helpfully kind of breaks down news podcasts into particular categories. And this is something that hadn't really been done in this sort of way before. So they make 2 distinctions between native podcasts, so those that are made specifically to be podcasts, and then catch-up radio. So basically repackaged content that's taken from sort of prior broadcast and then put out into the world as a podcast in new form. Then they've got a range of other categories as well, such as daily news and current affairs, unscripted talk or interview, narrative series on a single topic, so something like Serial, other documentary style podcasts that come out on a more regular basis, and then the audio long reads, such as The Guardian audio long reads. So these categories on the face of it seem fairly obvious, but I've found it really helpful to acknowledge the different styles and formats of these emerging news podcasts that are still relatively new form. I mean, the New York Times Daily podcast launched in 2017, and that's you know, hugely popular around the world. And in Australia, there's a range of podcasts that have kind of followed in the wake or in a similar style to the Daily, which has happened, I'm sure, in the UK as well. And on top of that as well, I mean, these are some sort of more legacy media organisations, but in the community radio space, which is what I'm working in, there are news podcasts, but they tend to be that more sort of catch-up radio style. And that, of course, is at least partly or substantially based on the fact that they're much easier to produce than a native podcast that requires often sort of more production and so on. And so what I've done so far in my research is try to examine the emerging stylistic conventions as a kind of new way of communicating the news, and look at what that means for the experience of democracy and democratic participation. And so I've developed this new sort of analytical listening framework that's both based on some of the guiding review principles in Radio Doc Review, an online journal, and some of those categories that were articulated in the Reuters report as well. And so I'm looking at things like the role of emotiveness and empathy, interview styles, narrative techniques, and creative use of sound, and kind of looking at what these emergent stylistic conventions are and how they compare and relate to some of those more traditional kind of normative journalistic values, such as objectivity, impartiality, and balance, and that sort of thing, to see how they might be. Cool, thank you. How they might be kind of communicating the news differently. And so I'm looking at this as well in the context of broader kind of disruption to mass media hegemonies and the kind of ideal functioning of the public sphere within that as well, and what the implications are for a new style of news communicated in podcast form, and particularly what potentialities there are within the community radio space for doing something slightly different to what's happening by those kind of legacy media outlets. And this sort of very quickly brings me to some of the questions I'm grappling with at the moment, which are very sort of big questions. One of those is podcasting as methodology, and I'm kind of engaging with a range of different theories on this. One of those is on Nick Couldry's socially oriented media theory, which kind of is based on the experiential nature of media consumption and how it kind of cautions against just latching on to the new kid on the block, such as the new technology, and instead recognizing that media consumption is particular for different demographics and different groups of people. So newspapers and television still play a really formative role for some people, whereas news podcasts are really significant for a different demographic. I'm also looking at practice-based research in podcasting and finding that there's a lot of practice-based research that's been written about in relation to visual arts, creative writing, and graphic design, but less so in relation to radio and podcasting. And then the role of self-reflexivity as well, in terms of unpacking the process of making the podcast and how I engage with some of those normative kind of journalistic values and those emergent news conventions, podcast news conventions that I've tracked through that kind of analytical framework that I'm developing at the moment. So that kind of presents a snapshot of what I'm doing and some of the sort of very big questions that I'm grappling with at the moment.
Thanks very much, Dylan. That was great. We do have one more presenter who I apologise for skipping over, but you weren't on my list. I'll justify it that way. And that is, of course, Kim Fox, who is making it possible for us all to be here today. So I will now hand over to Kim to present. Thank you, Kim.
All right, thanks, Jerry. I am with the American University in Cairo, and I have recently submitted an abstract to the journal Learning, Media, and Technology. They're doing a special call for Fem Ed Tech. And so I thought this project was a really good fit for that. The topic is young female podcasters from the Global South with a specific focus on Egyptian feminist perspectives. And I mentioned the methodology there, a mixed methods approach, and I'll detail that in just a moment. Obviously, I teach in Cairo in Egypt, and a lot of my students are young Egyptians, and like many universities, a lot of women, and we work on audio projects and podcasts. Invariably, a lot of the women end up selecting topics that are related to feminism. And so I'm very curious to know where they are getting the foundation for their feminist perspectives. And so that really does pretty much come up with the base for what I'm working on here. I've already pulled out the 5 particular podcasts that I would like to focus on. And these are podcasts that have been recipients of international award recognition. So the first part of the methodology is to do a textual analysis on the scripts that were a part of the projects to determine what kinds of themes are actually emerging from the projects. That will be followed up by a short survey just to survey the female podcasters to get some foundational information in terms of their exposure to feminism and why they decided on the topics that they decided on. And then I will expound on that a little bit further with some interviews to extract even more details about their methodologies for producing their podcast. After that, I want to layer in the theory. It's obviously going to be a feminist theory approach, but also the epistemology of feminism. I'm going to throw that in there. And it just seems like the topics are usually about, the injustice that women are suffering through in Egypt. So that will obviously come into play. And another thread from this will be Egyptian feminists, which has a very long history. And I want to dig into that a little bit more. The importance of this research is extensive. Looking through, doing a search, the Global South, we find that there's a lot of podcast research focused on men in the US, but the Global South just doesn't seem to be as rich. So adding that in there as well. Of course, podcasting from the feminist perspective, trying to build on that component. And just by default, the age, we're talking about young college women who are podcasters. In my case, the students are from affluent families, so there's a class component to this. And obviously, being in the Middle East and being in Egypt, there is a religious component to this as well. So all of this, I think, will really add a lot of richness to the topic. So yeah, I am under time, which is not what Jerry expected. But since it's just an abstract, that's where I'm at with this right now. I started to look at the literature and the lit review, and like I said, looking at Egyptian feminism. And I think that's a good start for pulling this together.
Thanks, Kim. Since you've put questions at the end there, I think what we'll do now is if we'll just open it up, and if anyone has any questions, can you use the little raise hand function on the chat, and then I will ask anybody who happens to raise their hand to speak and unmute your microphone, and I'll get through to you in the order that I see you. So we do have a hand raised, and that is Laurie Beckstead, who has a question.
Thank you. Hi, my question is for Dylan. Dylan, I'm curious to hear more, just a little bit about the styles and formats that you were talking about in journalistic or news-based podcasts. Could you just repeat the ones that you said? This is pertinent to my research. I'm trying to help determine like what are all of the possible formats that exist out there for podcasts. So it's interesting to me too. You said it's maybe kind of obvious, but I find it fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of raced over them because I realized I was going to go way over time if I if I kept to the pace that I planned. But so I found the way that they break them down in that Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism report really helpful. And so I'll just run through them a bit more slowly maybe. So one of them is daily news and current affairs. So that includes things such as, daily news podcasts such as The Daily by the New York Times or others that are published a few times per week. Then there's unscripted talk or interview show that really encompasses commentary, political analysis. You might have a couple of journalists kind of chewing the fat, that style of kind of very free-flowing style of podcast. Then there's narrative series, which is more the kind of documentary, single topic documentary, such as things like Serial or The Teacher's Pet here in Australia was an example. Then there's other documentary, which includes more sort of, often these ones might be taken from broadcast radio kind of documentary programs. So an example in Australia is Background Briefing on Radio National. And so they repackage that for podcast form, and it comes out, I think, every week, which is basically an investigative journalism podcast, but each episode deals with a separate issue. And the final one that they name is the audio long read, which, I mean, I haven't found any that I've come across apart from The Guardian's audio long read. So basically kind of an audio book, but non-fiction journalism style, I suppose. And so I'm kind of using that as a basis then to check whether the news podcast that I'm listening to can easily be placed into those categories. And it can be a little bit messy at times, but I'm finding it to be a really sort of helpful starting point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both. There's a question from Joe.
You'll unmute. I'm quite excited that we're using podcasting, or at least audio, as and the digital technologies involved in that as part of our data collection now, because a number of you mentioned that you were going to do analytical listening or critical analysis of a script, so I guess I wondered, so with Kim, you said you were going to read the scripts. Are you also thinking that you might actually get something out of listening to their podcast almost in a sort of oral history kind of way? Because do they stick to a script, or are they going off script? But because we can listen to these things over and over again, I wondered if you would.
Yeah, I will add. I think it was, for me, it's just a given that I will listen to them again. I've listened to them many, many times, but I definitely plan to listen again, because it's also about, the nuance of their delivery, the nat sounds, the research, all of that is going to be embedded in those projects. But I thought that if I pull out the scripts, I can then see the themes that emerge in the language that they've chosen to use.
Thank you, Kim. And Kim actually has a question for Gurvinder.
Yeah, I'm curious, Gurvinder, if what kinds of podcasts you're seeking some new podcasts titles, but do you have any examples? Because I have quite a few I think I can share.
Well, I was kind of thinking, initially, I thought I'd base it around some of the stuff that I listened to, but then I just thought, well, that's just too, like your own personal interests are not indicative of what everybody else would be listening to. So actually, kind of what I'm looking for is a broad range. Laurie messaged me and said that she obviously talked in her piece about the secret feminist agenda anyway, but I guess I might be leaning more towards the lack of women in podcasting potentially. So I think I'm open to all genres. I think for an ideal piece of research, it would be good to have one of most genres. So like something about gossip, comedy, something about arts and culture, something about, like another specialism. Otherwise, I think I naturally go towards news journalism type stuff, but that isn't what's really popular amongst the audience. The audience is more broader than that. But I think really what I'm looking for, a podcast that might be quite popular with audiences who are diverse, say with women, with people from different backgrounds, perhaps different age groups, because I guess that's where I want to explore that question of, is it more democratizing, and are we enabling alternative messages to come out there? So I kind of want to explore race in there as well. But so quite broad. So I think I'm quite happy to get people's suggestions and then spend some time kind of trawling through it myself, really, and listening. I think I'm going to have to listen to quite a lot to figure out what I want to focus on. Do you have any idea how I could get in touch with people who listen to them, though?
Well, yeah, if you're going to do the interviews, that would be interesting too. But the one podcast that I know that's popular, that has a strong audience, is actually two, Still Processing. They're two culture writers for the New York Times.
Yeah.
They're currently on hiatus, but their archive is there. And there's another new podcast called Fanti. I think you're going to find it very intriguing. They're two gay journalists who are talking about pop culture and social justice. And it's called Fanti, F-A-N-T-I.
Yeah, excellent. That's going to accompany me on the next time I go for a long run.
Thanks to both of you. I'm going to move on because we have a couple of more questions. Just worth saying that we can all get in touch with each other after this, or if anyone's watching this on YouTube, I'm sure we're all quite easily findable, or we can share details if you're happy with that as well. There's a question from Rebecca.
I just wanted to kind of pick up on this focus on podcasts and picking out our case studies. I wonder if anyone has thought about looking at production standards as a way of filtering through which podcasts you're looking at and the relationship to the audience. I'll contextualize that by saying I look a lot at music in the context of public service broadcasting. And one of the questions that I've been dealing with right at the moment is how those production standards actually might be part of a systemic bias in our systems. The fact that treble gets boosted, the fact that the limiter kicks in at a certain point isn't really great for the listening experience of certain types of music, and that potentially marginalizes those types of music from the radio. Podcasting is something very different, though, in that you can start thinking about the specialist audience and what production standards are ideal for that listening experience. And I wonder, when we're thinking about the diversity of audiences, whether we should be digging into those standards to see how particular producers and hosts are trying to connect by making sure that they've got an ideal setup.
So would anyone care to answer that question? Raise your hand if you would. Gurvinder?
I think that's a really interesting point. Because you could have the most amazing podcast, but if the production is not very good, it's just not going to be that appealing. So I think for me, I was thinking of sort of looking at fairly professional podcasts, but not necessarily ones from the big companies. So kind of just looking at the ones where people organically put them out, but don't have that corporate feel. Does that make sense? But I think that's interesting. I think that's definitely, I've noted that down as you said it, because I hadn't thought about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from Laurie.
Oops, thanks. Gurvinder, just sort of reacting to what you were talking about earlier. So I did a quick sort of look at the top, I think 30 or 50 podcasts I was presenting at a conference, and the topic was, is podcasting still a boys club? And so I just grabbed the top 50, and just as a kind of, almost just like a quick look at what the situation is, I just looked at who were hosting those podcasts. And looked at them from whether it was male or female. But I also found data in terms of listeners' preferences on Edison's audience research studies. And when you were asking about, what might be the best methods of collecting information about audiences' preferences, I mean, I just wonder if you could get in touch with one of the major audience research companies and see whether there's some way to get what the information you need through their extensive data collection methods or something like that. I don't know if that's even possible or if anyone has ever tried that.
I was thinking of contacting Ofcom, a bit like how Jerry did with his particular question. My feeling would be that Ofcom, I'm guessing, don't have that information, but I hadn't considered contacting Edison, and I have obviously come across them because that's where that particular statistic came out about American audiences. So that's a really good suggestion. So yes, I will look into that and drop them a line. I mean, people can only say no, right? So
sure. Yeah,
that's the main thing. I mean, I thought it was pretty impressive, Joey, that you contacted them and they've come back with that particular response, which is...
Well, I only did that because I was told by somebody who used to work for Ofcom that I should do it because they had the data, and then they told me they didn't. So, but I think it is worth putting those requests in, because it is, in the UK at least, the law that they're meant to provide that data if they're sitting on it. So why not give it a go? It only took, I think it took a few weeks for them to respond, but it wasn't too long.
Yeah, no, I will do. Thank you for that.
A few weeks ago, I reached out to both Edison and Reuters, and they were, I mean, both of them responded in the same day. So that was very, very impressive.
Thanks, Kim. Am I right in thinking that Dylan wanted to ask a question? You're muted, Dylan.
Yes, there we go. Perennial 2020 comment. Yeah, I was just a comment really on, or a thought based on what you were saying, Rebecca, is it's kind of interesting to me that on the one hand, there's been, the professionalization of podcasting, and the production values have certainly increased in some respects with, the very expensive commercialized products you can listen to, but also, and it's probably partly related to our experience with COVID, is that I think audiences have become a bit more forgiving of lesser quality audio. And maybe that's the case when it's kind of more a talks-based podcast and you can forgive that, that someone's speaking into a Zoom call or something like that. But it's kind of interesting to me that in the world of kind of radio documentary, those standards would not have been thought to be sort of good enough. But in some respects, we've got a little bit more forgiving with that. And I'm thinking about that as well in the podcast I'll eventually produce, and how I can source audio from, sort of diverse members of the public, and the most efficient way of doing that, but also maintaining some kind of standard. So I'm looking to kind of engage people to record their responses to different types of audio, or record how they listen to podcasts and how they experience them. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that I'm sort of grappling with at the moment as well, and how that might be shifting.
Yeah, and following on from that, Dario Linares, who was mentioned earlier, wrote an article recently about that very subject, about how the audio that's being produced during the lockdowns has deteriorated, but no one's kind of too bothered, because they're willing to put up with that kind of Zoom quality, if you like, just because of the content. So it's an interesting conversation to have had about that. I'm aware that we're getting towards an hour, and there is one hand up, so we'll try and make this the last question. Gurvinder?
I had a comment for Leon. When you were talking about other people who've perhaps done some work with community radio stations that are quite diverse, Rob Watson sprung to my mind at the Decentered Media. A lot of his work is centred in Leicester, and he and I have worked together in the past. But I know that he's worked with community radio stations, and I think he's gotten the main people, like, and I know they've been female managers, to do work with him and to give testimonies about the things that they do. So it'd be worth getting in touch with him, and I'm sure he could put you in touch with loads of other people. And he runs, Joe will help me on this, didn't he set up a community media group as well?
I think he's involved with a community group in Leicester.
Yeah, I think he tried to get a community sort of task force together for the CMA, but I'm not sure that that's continued. But if you just go to his decentered, he's got a blog as well.
Yeah,
he's getting very involved in a lot of community projects.
So that Rob Watson of Decentered Media.
Rob Watson, but also Caroline Mitchell. Don't forget, actually, a lot of her research is involved with community groups, community art groups, etc.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Gurvinder, I had a couple of people that you might want to interview in terms of their podcast listeners. I had just had and thought I can email you or whatever. And just very quickly, I know we're finishing, but I just thought, Josephine, I've got a background in fundraising and CSR, and I thought there was some interesting things that Jerry was saying there about you have to go to people to get them to do things. That's one of the things we're having at Real Rebels. Is how do you get young women of colour and young gay people to you've got to go to them really. They've got no role models here, and I think there's something very interesting there. Proposition for for companies that's very attractive in this at this moment in time, really. So that's just my bit, squeezing in there at the end. Yeah.
Thanks, Leon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for presenters for being so concise and making my job easy. And everyone give yourself a round of applause. And this video will be shared on YouTube in the next few days, and so you can share it on social media. And thanks very much, everyone, for joining us.